Should the wealthiest pay more tax? Well, that's a matter of opinion. Nick Clegg has his thoughts. Here are a few facts, though. Last week, the Office for National Statistics estimated the national wealth of the UK at £6.8 trillion. Most of an individual's wealth, according to ONS figures, is made up of the property they own and the private pension, if they have one, that they have. The gap between rich and poor is undeniably wider than ever. 10% of households in the UK have collective assets worth £10 million. By contrast, the poorest 10% of households in the UK are net debtors. That is to say, their liabilities are greater than their assets. Well, joining me now, Matthew Sinclair, Chief Executive of the TaxPayers Alliance, a man who thinks that wealth tax is a dead-end policy. Just explain, Mr. Sinclair, what you mean by that.
Well, it's been tried before. Back in the 1970s, Labour ran on a manifesto of introducing this tax, and they wound up having to back out, and then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey, said that we couldn't work out a tax that would produce enough revenue to be worth the administrative costs and the political hassle. And more recently, loads of countries that had wealth taxes were retreating from them. Ireland, Germany, Sweden recently, Italy considered one but then gave up because for exactly the same reason. Didn't think it would generate enough revenue to be worth the huge challenges which come with trying to impose a tax on these assets when most of that wealth is tied up, you say, in pension funds and property, which if we're going to start breaking down people's pensions, it's going to produce some very serious difficulties for the wider economy.
Well, let's look at pensions as a form of saving and perhaps leave that to one side at the moment. I mean, is there not a case, for example, for taxing, as you mentioned, property? Very hard to dodge as a tax. I mean, presumably straightforward to implement, therefore, and therefore collect, and perfectly logical.
Well, we have huge taxes on property. We have the highest taxes on property as a share of our national income in the developed world. We have big taxes in the form of stamp duty, in the form of council tax, in the form, when you talk about commercial property, of business rates.
But the taxes don't take account. I mean, council tax, for example, doesn't take account of the fact that when it was last valued, houses are now worth several times what they were.
But on the other hand, business stamp duty now can go up to 7%, and a 7% chunk out of an asset like that is an enormous tax. We have particularly high property taxes. The idea we're going to be able to get a huge amount of more revenue out of them without deterring people is just wrong. If you look at the market which has been affected by that 7% rate, it's declined. I think it's very doubtful whether that 7% stamp duty rate has raised any revenue, let alone whether a grand new wealth tax would.
Well, where do you stand on inheritance tax? I mean, again, this is a kind of controversial idea. It depends whether you think you're stealing hard-earned earnings or whether you think that people shouldn't necessarily inherit. It doesn't do them any good. I mean, where do you stand on that? I mean, because again, it strikes me that, you know, based on the fact that the concentration in the wealth is intensifying in the UK, there's a gap between rich or poor. Why not tax?
I think you're getting the problem with the concentration of wealth wrong. I mean, a lot of these people who would be affected by some of these taxes aren't massive plutocrats. People who have a substantial pension pot could be typically something like a civil servant retiring in sort of upper middle management will often have an enormous pension pot by value.
10% of the population have assets worth $4 million or
absolutely,
more.
But I mean, a pension pot of $1 million isn't that much. Now, what I'm getting at is the problem is there are massive people who aren't managing to save, aren't managing to build up assets, and those who have small savings are being absolutely destroyed by high taxes on that capital. What we should be doing is trying to help them, not trying to tear down those who are provided for. So I think inheritance tax as an additional tax because someone's had the temerity to die is wrong and shouldn't be around.
OK, Matthew Sinclair, Chief Executive of the TaxPayers Alliance, thank you very much. It's an unpopular policy with most people. Half of people don't like the idea of inheritance tax, although only 4% of estates paid it last year.